Well, I'm a human performance scientist. How we can make the science of human performance really simple, practical, accessible. High performance is being used as a brand for various different podcasts and products and services. People have kind of got this idea of what the costume of high performance looks like.
In today's episode, we sit down with Dr. James Hewitt, a renewed human performance scientist committed to empowering knowledge workers with science-based tools to achieve sustainable high performance.
And they think that it's this kind of, very detailed set of things that you do every day and waking up at 5 a.m. and having exactly the same breakfast and controlling everything and everything being perfect. But the reality is that when I think about these high performance habits, I think it's really important to be the most effective and the habits which actually make the biggest difference are really pretty simple.
From uncovering the secrets of sustainable high performance to practical tips on balancing effort and recovery, Dr. Hewitt shares invaluable insights and advice to help you unlock your full potential and maintain it sustainably.
Many leaders good leaders are quite self-sacrificial. Do as I say, not as I do. 80% of people said that they expect their CEO to model healthy well-being behaviors, always on work, many more back-to-back meetings, expectation that we will respond very rapidly to messages, and people can get caught in this vicious cycle. I'm on a mission to try and help people to realize more of their potential in life and work.
If you are an improver seeking for effective and pragmatic ways to achieving high performance while also taking good care of your well-being, this episode is for you. James Hewitt, a warm welcome to the Energy Lab podcast. I'm super excited and very much looking forward to our conversation. Welcome.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, likewise, I'm really looking forward to speaking with you as well. I think it'd be fun.
Wonderful. I have one question that I love to ask my guests, and that's the beginning of our conversation. Your superpower. What's your superpower?
Yeah, you were kind enough to prompt me with this question in advance so that I could think about it a little bit. But I think my answer is quite clear. I would say that my superpower is curiosity. My curiosity is something that's always driven me to explore new questions, try and find answers. It's always been focused around this notion of human performance and what human beings are capable of, even though I might not always have articulated it like that. But my curiosity in that question related to what are humans capable of if we provide them with the right resources, they develop the appropriate capabilities, they have the opportunity, and what can we achieve as human beings has always fascinated me, and my curiosity has led me to explore that and hopefully have a positive impact on other people through it too.
That's a wonderful superpower to have, because this can open the doors for so many things, whatever your curiosity is on, and you will put your energy on it. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing it with us. And I share with you some of the ideas I had for this conversation, so you more or less you know what we're going to talk about. What do you think? Why should people stay tuned?
Yeah, so well, I'm a human performance scientist, as you will have heard in that introduction, and I'm really fascinated about the relationship between well-being and performance. But I'm also really passionate about how we can make the science of human performance really simple, practical, accessible, useful, probably most importantly. So if people stay tuned, we're going to share some of the science of human performance. We can talk about some of these deep topics, but also I really think that people are going to get something very useful that they can take away to apply to themselves, but maybe apply to their teams as well, that will hopefully help them to realize a bit more of their potential and improve their well-being and performance in the process. So I've set out our stall now. We're going to have to try and meet that bar over the next few minutes.
Yeah, that sounds definitely very convincing to me, and you already mentioned a few of the key words that definitely will keep people or will make people stay tuned, and has to do definitely with performance. This is one of your main expertises. If you would define sustainable high performance, how would that sound like?
So there's a lot of people talking about sustainable high performance increasingly. I mean, I've been speaking about this and researching it now for over 10 years, 15 years probably. And I remember when we kind of came up with this this title, sustainable high performance. Not many people were using it, but it seems like a lot of people are now. So it's likely that you're going to find several different definitions. But my way of thinking about sustainable high performance is that it's about balancing the relationship between effort and recovery to be able to meet the demands of life and work consistently. And so that is sustainable performance. The high performance part of that would be recognizing that meeting the demands of life and work, think about it like a spectrum. So for me, high performance would be really kind of meeting and perhaps even exceeding those demands, really being at the top end of that spectrum. Whereas sometimes, sustainable performance might just be getting by. It might just be doing enough. And I think that's an important distinction in terms of the way that I think about sustainable high performance, because sometimes when we talk about peak performance and high performance, we have this idea of this theoretical benchmark. Perhaps you might call it a personal best in an athletic context, or maybe your best ever day in the context of the workplace. And sometimes it's helpful to think about those benchmarks and to aim for them, but in a less adaptive sense, in a way that's potentially less helpful. Sometimes those benchmarks of when we performed our absolute best can actually sometimes make us feel like we're failing, like we're not quite living up to our own expectations. So I think it's helpful to recognize that performance is often expressed as a range, that sometimes we're going to be right at the top of our potential, but other days our potential, what we can actually do, might be a little bit lower, and that's fine. But fundamentally, it is about that relationship between effort and recovery, and meeting the demands of life and work, whatever those might be. And perhaps we can explore some of the ways that we can support those demands and balance that relationship in the rest of our conversation.
It's a good integration because, as you said, sustainability in performance, you don't think about the peak performance because it needs to last in time. And peak performance is usually pushing, and not really being very sustainable in terms of what we believe or think about. So the integration on sustainable high performance sounds like the good mix. Otherwise, it can be, one way or the other. So it sounds like a mix of that high in long term, with respecting probably the energy available, right? Because it's not an unlimited resource, human energy and brain capacity. So brain performance, talking about the mental part specifically. It's body and mind, I guess, right? But we're talking more as well more about the brain capacity. What are the habits related to it? This could be a very long answers, I know, but if you would summarize, what are the high performance habits if we think about sustainable as well? What do you think of? Maybe your top couple, 3 habits.
I think it's a good question, and I think that I'd probably set a bit of context before I shared some of these habits, or my view on what maybe the most important habits are, because you raised a really important point about a distinction between sustainable high performance and peak performance. And I think this is a conversation that seems to be emerging, and it seems to be more common as this idea of high performance is being used as a brand for various different podcasts and products and services all over the internet, it seems, and all over the marketplace. But often when people talk about high performance, I almost feel like it's, for want of a better phrase, it's almost kind of cosplaying high performance. And by that, I mean, people have kind of got this idea of what the costume of high performance looks like. And they think that it's this kind of, very detailed set of things that you do every day, and waking up at 5 a.m. and having exactly the same breakfast and controlling everything and everything being perfect. But the reality is that on the ground of high performance, in a business context or in a sporting context, where I've been privileged enough to be able to work with people in those contexts, whether that's a high performance athlete in motorsport, in Formula One, or in professional cycling, or in alpine skiing, or in a business context with Fortune 500 companies and some leading executives. The reality of high performance every day is that people are often having to operate in a very imperfect environment. So you talk about Formula One, for example, people sometimes have this idea that everything is perfect and this environment around them is optimal. But the reality is that often they're a bit jet lagged. They're having to turn up and make the best of the conditions that they find themselves in. And many things are controlled, but sometimes things are outside of control. The same with business executives who, sometimes they might pop up on a podcast and talk about their habits of whatever they're doing to try and optimize well-being and performance. But often they'll have to perform in a suboptimal condition. They wake up after not having enough sleep and still need to be able to perform at their best. So I think sometimes there's a risk when we talk about high performance habits that we can actually set up these protocols or patterns which only work in optimal conditions. Whereas the reality of sustainable high performance is we really need to be able to meet those demands to balance effort and recovery as well as we can, given often things in our environment and our life which we can't control, which are unexpected, and we might class as kind of suboptimal. So when I think about these high performance habits, I think it's really important to be practical and also pragmatic. And by that, I mean, we might understand kind of what the gold standard is, but then it's important to kind of think back and work down that hierarchy from the gold standard and consider what's really possible given the constraints or the things that are going on in my situation right now. And so really for me, while I've delved really deep into the science of human high performance, the most effective and the habits which actually make the biggest difference are really pretty simple. And in my view, it revolves around sleep, nutrition, and physical activity, and the intersection of those three different categories. And if I was to sum it up and say, what are we aiming for in those three different areas? Well, with sleep, I think it's quite clear that we should be aiming for at least 7 hours per night, because for 99% of the population or more, if you don't sleep for 7 hours, you start to see deteriorations in psychological and physiological performance. Unless you've got kind of a rare genetic mutation, you're not going to be performing optimally if you're sleeping fewer than 7 hours per night long term. Now, that said, I recognize that for many people, sometimes that's not possible. And so at the same time, I think it's important not to obsess necessarily about that 7 hour threshold and recognize that there are going to be points in your life where actually sleep will be disrupted. And you know what? You'll probably be fine. You'll be able to perform. Perhaps you're going to have to put in more effort to get the same outcome as a result of that. But I really am quite resistant to this notion that seems to be emerging at the moment that sleep is a performance. And, there's wearable manufacturers who are really emphasizing and perhaps unhelpfully encouraging people to fixate on this notion of sleep as performance, even with sleep performance scores. But I'm really adamant that sleep is not something that we perform, it's something that we experience. And while we know that adequate sleep, meaning at least 7 hours per night, is really, really important, I think it's also critical that people don't get too fixated on this idea that if you're not achieving that every single day, really, really bad things are going to happen. Even though we know the evidence is quite clear that 7 hour threshold is really important. I'd also say in relation to sleep that a habit related to that is obviously sleep consistency. And again, we know that going to bed and waking up at a really consistent time, being as consistent as possible with the time that we go to bed and the time that we get up in the morning, is also critically important. So in an ideal world, the top of that hierarchy, the gold standard, it would be at least 7 hours and going to bed and waking up at the same time. But again, we know that doesn't always work out in normal everyday life and work. And there was a really interesting consensus statement published last year where a group of sleep experts got together. And while they really emphasized the importance of getting adequate sleep at least 7 hours, going to bed and waking up at a consistent time, they also recognized that if you're not getting to sleep enough during the week, then it's actually better to sleep in a bit and catch up at the weekend rather than not do that, rather than prioritize consistency in that case. So again, we can see this kind of pragmatic approach, which I think is helpful for many people. So we could talk about sleep at length, and I'm really happy to do that maybe later in our conversation, but that's one habit. Another habit I talk about is nutrition. And with nutrition, obviously, it's probably one of the most contentious areas when we talk about well-being, health, performance. And I think one of the reasons for this is that nutritional research is really hard to do. You've kind of got two choices really with nutritional research. You can either try and control every variable around a group of participants. And a classic example of that are bariatric ward studies, where basically you lock people in a laboratory You measure everything that they consume, all the energy they expend, and you're able to get this kind of more precise view of how a particular intervention or diet might be actually influencing the person or the group. The problem with that is it doesn't necessarily reflect how people live and function in a natural setting in the real world. So your other option to counter that is to try and observe people in their everyday life. And you might still try and intervene and control their diet. But often with those type of studies, you're really reliant on people's self-reports. And unfortunately, we humans are not very good at remembering what we ate and drank or when. And sometimes when we're self-reporting, there's also something called social desirability bias, so social desirability bias. It basically describes how when we respond to surveys, we sometimes tend to respond in the way that we that might help us to be perceived in a way that's more favorable, rather than responding in a way that truly reflects how we're behaving and truly reflects reality. So the net result of this is that nutrition research is quite fuzzy. It's not all of particularly good quality. And also, there's all these intervening factors. Some of those, as I mentioned, social desirability bias, lack of controls, or on the other hand, something that's very well controlled but not representative. And then you've also got this issue that we don't eat kind of nutrients or ingredients. We eat foods, and foods are generally multi-ingredient and multi-nutrient, and all these things are interacting. So this makes it very hard to do nutritional research, to develop findings which are going to be really relevant and dependable. And on top of this, we've also got all these opinions and conflicting views and people trying to build businesses out of being dietitians and nutritional advisors and nutritionists. So when I talk about nutrition, I think about what does nutrition look like for sustainable high performance. I think it's important to recognize some of these complexities and some of these issues, but also, again, to try to make it as simple as possible. And there's a very famous kind of author, Michael Pollan, and he came up with this phrase, which you're probably familiar with, which I think really sums up probably the most dependable advice when it comes to nutrition very well. He simply said, eat real food, mostly plants, not too much. And
that's wonderful.
If most of us followed that,
genius. Yeah, that's true, because it's summarized in a few words. Yeah,
that's it. So that'd be my high performance habit with nutrition: eat real food, not too much, mostly plants. So we've got sleep, we've got nutrition, and then finally physical activity. And these three things all interact. So we know, for example, with sleep and nutrition, that if you haven't slept enough, it makes it much harder to make healthy food choices. So when sleep is restricted, our self-regulation is impaired. We're more likely to overeat, to choose less healthy options. And also it can affect our metabolism in unhelpful ways. So after sleep is restricted for several nights, we start to see disruptions in our metabolism that mimic what you might see in someone who is type 2 diabetic, or pre-diabetic rather. So we know sleep and nutrition are very closely related, both behaviorally and also physiologically. But then obviously we've got this physical activity piece, which is also critically important. And again, there's so much research into the effect of physical activity. Physical activity is so critical in terms of helping our metabolism and our physiology to function healthily, for our health span, so how long we're going to live relatively free from disease. It's also incredibly powerful in terms of its positive effects on our mental health and our psychological well-being, boosting positive mood, reducing the risk of depression, even simply by moving around more, not even doing structured physical activity in the form of exercise. But again, I try and sometimes think about heuristics that I can share with people to try and synthesize all this evidence. And so when it comes to physical activity, again, I've got a phrase which I use to try and sum up the practical actions that might be helpful to take. And I sum it up as follows. I say that if we find ways to move more, move slow, move fast, and move heavy consistently and with some regularity, you're probably getting the mix that you need. And by that, I mean move more, which means try and reduce sedentary time. Just move around more often, get up from your desk, go for some walks in the day. People fixate about this 10,000 steps a day. And, obviously, we all know now it was a marketing campaign by a Japanese pedometer company decades ago. But actually, the evidence is pretty clear that if you get towards 10,000 steps a day, it's probably a good thing. But a simple way to think about that is simply try and move more. Move slow is about more deliberate aerobic exercise. And so now everyone's talking about zone 2, aren't they? But essentially, moving at a pace, whether it's cycling, whether it's a brisk walk, whether it's jogging, whether it's swimming, where your heart rate is elevated, your breathing rate is slightly higher, but it's not so high that you couldn't speak in a complete sentence without taking a breath. And so that's a really simple rule of thumb for that move slow intensity. Move fast is about high intensity training. And we know that it's a bit of an oversimplification, but you can imagine that that move slow component, that aerobic exercise, one of the primary stimuli that provides is to increase the efficiency of our cardiovascular system. We can see there's an increase in the number of these mitochondrial energy factories, these cells which are actually responsible for the replenishment of energy for movement, but actually for everything that we do, for all of human function. But we know that high intensity exercise is also really critically important. And one of the adaptations that stimulates is actually to improve the efficiency and the activity of these mitochondrial energy factories. So moving slow increases the number of them, moving fast increases their activity. Now, the reality is that there's crossover between the two, but it's sometimes helpful to simplify it. But we know that some high intensity exercise is critical. And then at the top of that, the final piece being moving heavy, some resistance exercise. Because we know, again, that having healthy muscle, retaining, perhaps building muscle, is really critical for longevity, for health span, but also for even metabolic function and movement and quality of life today, not just in the future. So move more, move slow, move fast, move heavy, and think about how movement, exercise, physical activity, as I describe it, plus nutrition, plus sleep, those three kind of core habits, they're going to be providing the foundation for well-being, for sustainable high performance. And they'd be the three areas I'd be encouraging people to really focus in on.
You brilliantly summarized the very basics in such an easy way that I think even, sometimes people are overwhelmed by, words or phrase or framework here and methods there. And then at the end, you have no idea what you're going to do. But at the end, the real important things are the very basics. So trying the hacks for this and that without mastering the basics is nonsense, right? And the way you just summarize those 3 points that build up the foundation is fantastic. Thanks for that. And I love the fact that at the beginning you mentioned this imperfect environment we live in, because that's another problem for many people. They feel discouraged. They try to do things perfectly because they heard it from the one or the other podcast, or they read in the one or the other books or influences, who knows what. And then they obsess with it. And at the end, you even got, more stress. And the topic sleep, it's the perfect example. And I did
Absolutely.
it myself. I was reading a book, a very well-known book on sleep, and I never had problems before with sleep. I started to have sleep problems, really, because all of this kind of making, that fear behind that, if I don't do that like this, if it's not perfect, if I wake up once or more, and you're really obsessed with it. So the imperfect environment is the world we live in. We cannot create something that is perfect in a world that is not perfect, because that's not life, right? In the ideal world, maybe,
absolutely.
but not in real life. So I love the practicability or the pragmatic approach that you just mentioned. I think that's the most valuable for all of us, no matter what we do. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And thank you for the feedback on that.
Thanks to you. And going to the topics, you work a lot with leaders, organizations. I was thinking about, where do you see, if you see differences in the habits of leaders and employees when it comes down to sustaining high performance? And I was thinking about which are the differences, but I don't even know if there are any differences. From your experience, what would you say are those differences? And how can as well an entire company benefit if they manage to establish habits for sustaining high performance?
I think so. Thinking about the difference between leaders and their teams is an interesting question. It's also an important question, I think, for several reasons. I definitely have seen differences. I think one of the differences that I see is that many leaders good leaders are quite self-sacrificial. There's a tendency sometimes to put their team above themselves. And sometimes this manifests in a phrase that we have, which is do as I say, not as I do. Now, that can be expressed really unhelpfully and in a toxic way as well, in the sense that it might be that the leader is kind of operating selfishly and being unkind to their teams and being even hypocritical in some ways. But in the context of well-being and sustainable performance, more often what I'll see is that you'll have a leader who will say things like, I really want you to prioritize your well-being. I think it's really important that you sleep adequately. But they themselves will not be looking after their well-being and sleeping adequately, because somehow they feel that because they're responsible for people, that they shouldn't be taking breaks, that they shouldn't be finishing on time, and that maybe that's even a good thing, that it's showing that they really care by sacrificing their own health and well-being for the sake of their team. And so I think it's really important that we challenge that type of thinking, because we know that type of behavior is actually counterproductive. We could talk about sleep, for example, in relation to that. So there's a great researcher called Christopher Barnes who's done a lot of research on the relationship between sleep and leadership. And some of his research, for example, has demonstrated that when leaders don't sleep adequately, that they're actually rated as less inspirational by their team. And there's a number of different reasons for this, but it seems to boil down to the fact that when leaders don't sleep enough, they engage in something called surface acting, which means that they don't express their emotions, they don't communicate as authentically, and their team members pick up on that. We also know that when people don't sleep enough, emotional regulation is impaired. And so people are much more likely to behave in less helpful ways. It might be that they're slightly more dismissive. It might be that they don't listen as effectively. We know that not sleeping enough also impairs creativity and problem solving, which are going to be critical skills for leaders. Very often it might be that the leader has to solve a problem of their own. Perhaps team members come to them and ask for help with their problems. But that problem solving is really going to be diminished and made much more difficult when leaders haven't slept enough. So leaders looking after their well-being is really critical, but sometimes they don't. There's also some interesting data that I think speaks to not just the importance of leaders looking after their well-being, but also expectations of team members about their leaders. So sometimes I think some leaders maybe feel that they don't have permission to look after their well-being because they don't want to put themselves first. But actually, there's a very large survey that's conducted periodically. It's called the Edelman Trust Barometer Survey, and it featured most recently about 32,000 respondents, if I remember correctly. And according to that survey, 80% of people said that they expect their CEO to model healthy well-being behaviours, which could, for instance, include healthy boundaries between work and home life. So there's this increasing expectation that leaders will model healthy behaviours, but also it seems increasingly clear that what leaders do does reproduce and kind of trickles down, cascades down through organisations. So sometimes you will see this difference between leaders and team members. Other times you'll see very similar characteristics. You'll see very similar behaviours. But the leader's behaviour is often a really key driver down that chain through the organisational chart, unfortunately for both good and for bad. So I definitely do see differences, but I think it is critically important that leaders model the behaviours that they want to see in their teams, that they don't necessarily think that they're different or immune. They don't trivialise lack of sleep, for example, for instance, in relation to those topics that we just talked about a moment ago. Looking at leadership capabilities which are either impaired or really supported by sleep.
And you mentioned as well the credibility and the credibility and the authority. I would add as well probably the fact that we lead by example, and we trust leaders who give an example, right? If leaders don't really walk the talk and they just do something else from what they preach, how credible they are. And as well, another topic is culture, right? The company culture, because if the leader just set some program, something that their employees need to do, how feasible or how credible it is if it's not as a part of the company culture, just like an activity or something pushed from the outside, that people would say, I have so much things to do. I'm busy all the time. It's one thing more I need to do, right? So it kind of needs to become part of the company culture. And how can become part of a culture if leaders don't do it? This is kind of counterintuitive. I don't know if what's the right word, but it doesn't. I think it doesn't help to create that environment within a company. So that's very interesting. And actually, I have another question on this topic. I will ask you afterwards. But this is interesting from hearing from someone like you working with companies. More or less, which are the main behaviors behind leaders and company regarding to this. In your experience, what are the biggest obstacles in achieving optimal state that allows us day by day in our work, in our daily life, to function at our greatest potential? Obstacles.
So I think obviously this is going to be different for different people in different sectors of the workplace. In most of my work and research is really focused around knowledge work. So that's work where we think for a living. And we manage the flows of information and which makes work quite abstract. We spend a lot of time on computers, for example. There'll be a huge amount of communication involved. But I describe it mainly as thinking for a living. That's one way to think about knowledge work. But in the context of knowledge work, I think in answer to your question, some of the biggest challenges to sustainable high performance really go back to that original point that I made, that they relate to the relationship between effort and recovery, and often an imbalance between effort and recovery. And that imbalance is often driven by something I describe as always on work. So always on work describes how work, rather than being characterized by clear boundaries between work and home life, starts to permeate every aspect of our life. So we're always on. So we're continually in this state of constant partial attention, finding it very difficult to get a sense of mental distance from work, to down-regulate at the end of the day, perhaps to relax and even to sleep. And I think many of us would probably relate to this. There's data which support that contention. Microsoft have got some really great data because obviously so many people use their software, and they've highlighted that after hours work, which generally describes work that is completed after 5 or 6 p.m. in local time, has increased significantly over the last few years. During the workday, intensity has also increased. There's been kind of 156% increase in the number of meetings, more back-to-back meetings. And it seems that during the pandemic, when we shifted to a remote work model primarily, for many knowledge workers, I know obviously different industries were affected in different ways, but for knowledge workers, that meant many more virtual meetings. But it seems that when we've shifted off into these hybrid or sometimes even back to an in-person model, we've retained this very high volume of virtual meetings, this expectation that we will respond very rapidly to messages, plus some in-person and hybrid type interactions as well. And the net result of that is that it does seem that while at a societal level, working hours have decreased in recent decades, actually for many knowledge workers, they're finding their work day is getting longer, that they are always on. And as a result of that, they're finding they're putting in more effort. There's a sense that demands are growing, but their recovery is really impaired. And people can get caught in this vicious cycle, because then if your recovery is impaired, then your effort might still be high, but actually you can become less efficient. That means that you might the quality of your work might suffer, or it might take you longer to perform at the same level, to generate the same quality of work as you were before. And we can also see this expressed in relationships between stress and sleep, for example, where we know that stress can interfere with sleep, but also sleep is anxiogenic. It can generate stress. And for some knowledge workers, there's what I'd call this kind of doom loop, where people are working long hours, they get home, they struggle to switch off and get a sense of mental distance. So they turn to alcohol as a way to kind of boost mood, help them relax, get a sense of mental distance and wind down. But then that alcohol consumption impairs their sleep quality. So they wake up in the morning feeling more tired. They perhaps try and use caffeine to overcome that sense of tiredness. Then they work through the day, but again, they feel stressed because they're overwhelmed and they've not slept enough and they're not thinking as clearly as they might. So what do? They turn to alcohol again, and this cycle just is perpetuated and sometimes ends up getting worse and worse and worse. So I really think that if we want to look at the biggest blockers, I'd say always on work, an imbalance between effort and recovery, generating these negative spirals. And one of the most important things that we can do is to try to find ways to break those cycles, and ideally initiate a positive spiral where people's resources start to be replenished, and help them to get out of these negative spirals, which unfortunately for some people eventually do lead to burnout or experiences of burnout symptoms at the very least.
And I think there it's important to have the right inspiration, example, inputs to get out of this vicious cycle. And as you said, you need something else to replace. Otherwise, you keep on doing the same things. Or sometimes to create change, we need to substitute, right? So, and being aware, of course, is the first step. But then you need to know as well what to do. And that's probably where, there's a lot of information around, but sometimes we're overwhelmed from information. It's like too much. It's not always the best solution. So having, in that case, something simple, easy, and practicable that everyone can do, I think that's something that could be very helpful for many. This could be actually one topic for a whole conversation, like to give some practical tips there. But I'm very curious about another topic within what you just said, the role of purpose. Like if you think about we just mentioned some obstacles, we talk about habits, and those are things that we do or don't do. But if we think like go a bit deeper into our why we do what we do and look a bit more of the meaning behind it, does purpose as a role in your experience, knowledge, expertise in well-being and performance?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think purpose is critical, isn't it? I think we'd all like to have a sense that we are working towards something bigger than ourselves, that there's a sense of meaning in what we do. And I think that meaning and purpose can sometimes intersect, the value in what we're doing, feeling that it's important and that it's worthwhile. Your question brought to mind a survey which was conducted by the Harvard Business Review a little while ago. And they polled a group of people, quite a large group of people, and more than 90% of the people who responded to that poll said that work should provide some sense of purpose in life. And so purpose in life is defined as having a full life with goals. And in the definition, it says it's a full life with goals and directionality in line with our values. And it really matters for well-being and performance. Another way that I think about purpose is sometimes that it provides the why for what we do. So, in the sense of work and purpose, ideally, I don't think that we want work to be to represent our entire source of purpose in life, but I do think purpose in work matters, and the HBR survey certainly supports that notion. It's something that I would agree with personally as well, that I do feel that my work is purposeful. That sense that I'm on a mission to try and help people to realize more of their potential in life and work using these science-based tools that hopefully I can provide people with. But I think it's also valuable for employers as well as employees. So there was some research by McKinsey, and that indicates that employees who experience a stronger sense of purpose or get as much purpose as they would like from their work, I think that's how the question was phrased, if I remember correctly, were more engaged, more motivated, more satisfied, but they were also higher performing and more likely to stay in their job, less likely to leave, which makes sense because, if you feel that your work is aligned with your values and your sense, and there's a sense that what you're doing is worthwhile, you're much more likely to stick at that job. So, purpose is really critically important, I think, for those of us who are working. I also think that it's important as we get older. And, another study that that popped into our mind when you mentioned that question was in relation to how purpose seems to promote resilience to something called age-related cognitive decline. So, as we get older, unfortunately, we know that our risk of experiencing a deterioration in our cognitive capabilities, perhaps even related to our brain physiology, does seem to increase. That risk increases. So in this study, they looked at middle-aged adults. I think it was 600 or so people. And they looked at these tiny areas of, there's no other way to put it really, brain damage, which emerge as we age, this neurodegeneration. And what they found was that people who had a higher sense of purpose in life exhibited better cognitive performance than those with similar levels of this brain damage. So that seems to indicate that this sense of purpose in life had this kind of protective effect. And overall, these complementary forms of evidence at different life stages, both for people who are currently in work, for people who are getting older, in my view, really strongly indicates that having this sense of purpose in life is really critical for both our well-being and our performance. And so I do often really encourage people to reflect on their why and ask that question: what is the why behind what they are doing? And is what they're doing really aligned with their values and their sense that what they're doing is worthwhile? And that's not always possible in the workplace. But if you're not getting it in work, then I really encourage people to explore how they might be able to enrich their lives and find that sense of purpose in other things that they do. And I know many people who are in that situation. Their day job might not interest them that much. They do it because it pays the bills. But their hobbies, the community that they're part of, other activities that they engage in really do provide that sense of purpose and that why. And I'd really hope that more people can find that, because as we've just heard, the evidence is really strong that it's going to be helpful for both our health as well as our performance too.
So whether within or outside of work, having that strong why, it's also what keeps us going. And it's not wonder that the brain, the images, or whatever we may call the changes that happen in our brain are less bad or less negative, because of probably as well the effort you keep on putting is driven by the why. If you have the strong why, you don't give up usually, or you keep on really doing with more energy, you have more enthusiasm, and you keep on using your brain as well in a different way, probably also more intensively than when you're just doing things because you need to do them. And also the overall happiness feeling and all the hormones and all the wonderful system that it's inside our wonderful, complex, and at the same time easy functioning, right? And really creating all that we need to then be thriving. Thank you for this explanation. Super interesting, James. Thank you. If you think about work-related wellness in 5 years, in the next 5 years, are there any trends or any interesting things that you would like to share with us?
Yeah. So I think one of the trends is that people are getting a bit disillusioned. Unfortunately, I think people are, there's a lot of workplace wellbeing programs which don't seem to be that effective, that people are getting a bit disillusioned with because they've tried them and they haven't really seen the changes they were hoping for. But at the same time, I think this is perhaps initiating this new phase where people are being much more clear about what they're trying to achieve, what they're hoping to see. People are maybe going to start to take less of what I'd call a scattergun approach. So they're going to be more deliberate about thinking about what workplace wellbeing interventions they try and apply, they try and bring into the workplace. I think there's a trend towards people being more conscious about the importance of measuring outcomes. So you don't just kind of throw an intervention in and then suddenly realize that you've not thought about how you're going to measure whether it's working or not. And there's definitely a trend towards recognizing, but also implementing measurement tools and systems to think about that. But I think for me, one of the most positive changes is that there's this increasing recognition that simply pushing more individual level interventions into the workplace is maybe necessary, but not sufficient. So by that, I mean, for example, that it's fantastic if we provide people with better nutrition and access to healthier food in the workplace. Great. Or maybe rooms to relax and recharge. But unless we address systemic issues, so things like poorly defined job roles, overwhelming demands, unrealistic expectations, then you can provide as many yoga classes as you want and meditation app subscriptions as you can afford, but you're really not going to get to the root cause of the problem. So I think this trend towards some root cause analysis, understanding what might really be driving compromised well-being, also what might support sustainable high performance and better health and well-being for workplaces, and taking a more considered, measurable view on what's actually going to work and make a difference is a trend that I see emerging and I really hope continues to accelerate, so that more people can experience a better life and hopefully sustainable high performance in their work, and that will have a spillover into their outside of work and into the rest of their life as well.
That sounds like a very good trend, like cheering for it, because everything scratching the surface is not going to create change, right? We talk about sustainability in terms of performance, but the same concept applies to as well well-being in the workplace if it's just like the one product or the gym membership or the yoga classes. It's at the end of the day, if it's not something woven into the company itself. And this is linked as well to what you said before about leadership, right? It's all connected. So at the end of the day, the conversation must be a bit deeper in terms of what is really creating long-lasting changes. And of course, I had this conversation on return on investment on companies, and at the end of the day, it's always paying off because of employees retain or new employees, acquisition, and as well performance, because people just perform better. There are a bunch of numbers about this. I think you know them probably partially by heart. The percentages more of how well or better, and at the end, how much more positive outcomes a company has when it really takes care about the employees, not just because it needs to do that, because it really means it. So I love the trend that you mentioned. Thanks for sharing it. And thanks for sharing all the super interesting topics that you mentioned before. I think that there are a few that are really like worth going deeper and having a whole conversation deeper into it, or maybe anything that you want to share, I can add in the comments or in the description if there are any resource, anything you want to share. But I wanted to ask you, while thanking you for your precious time, how can people connect with you? Anything you want to mention? How can people connect with you? And if you have a last word or anything what we just said, if you want to share with us anything additional, I'm happy to hear.
We've covered quite a lot of topics, haven't we? And we've covered quite a lot of ground. I feel like, as you said, there's all kinds of different threads that we could pull from there, and other things that we could talk about. I think all I would say is that I'd encourage people to maybe go away and think about one thing that they could apply from that conversation, and perhaps focus in on those 3 habits, or those 3 areas of habits: the sleep, the nutrition, the physical activity. And try and keep it simple. If someone's a leader, maybe think about the impact that following or adopting some of those habits might have on themselves as well as their teams. But in terms of where people can connect with me, I'm very active on LinkedIn, as you know, and really appreciate our interactions there, and your posts as well. But I really encourage people to find me on LinkedIn, James Hewitt, and follow me there. And I'd really welcome your thoughts on my posts and an opportunity to continue the conversation. I've also got a website, which is jameshewittperformance.com, and where I share blogs. I go deeper on some of these topics. You can also book me for your speaking events if you're interested. A lot of what I do is speaking communication, and there's a newsletter which you can sign up to there if you're interested too. But I'd say they were the 2 main channels: LinkedIn or my website, and would really welcome the opportunity to connect with some of your listeners, hear their thoughts on what we've discussed, and perhaps continue the conversation in that format through those channels.
That sounds great. Thank you, James. It was really a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully I will see you again, or we will talk again and share some more of the super interesting topics. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.